Good evening, everyone. To everyone who's still trickling in, we'll give if everyone can please remain on mute as
Are
they
you
enter.
interested in Kawartha Lakes thing?
I'll ask if everyone can please remain on mute as they enter in the call. That'd be great. We'll get started in a couple minutes as people continue to trickle in. Just going to give everyone a couple minutes here. Thank you all for joining us. And as I said before, if you are able to keep yourself on mute as you hop in, that would be fantastic. And welcome to have your video on or off as whatever works for you. All right, I think we'll give everyone 1 minute or so to jump in. Thanks so much to everyone who's been able to join us so far. All righty, everyone. I may get started just with some introductions and just some housekeeping items as people continue to trickle in. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we really appreciate you taking your time to join us. My name is Matt Rodriguez, a planner at WSP, the consulting firm that's working with the city on the rural zoning bylaw review. We're excited to be back out, albeit virtually, in the community to talk about the Kawartha Lakes rural zoning bylaw review. The objective of this meeting is to provide an update on the project since we were last out in the community in September 2019, including the types of issues that we'll be looking at through this process, as well as how we're going to approach this project. As you're certainly most likely aware, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and evolving public health guidelines and restrictions to limit gatherings and maintain distancing, this meeting is being held virtually. And before we get started, this is just a reminder that tonight's open house is being recorded, including the chat box feature, and a video recording will be posted on the Jump In website following tonight's session. So I think a couple more people have been able to join us, so I'll jump right over to our agenda for this evening. So here's just a brief agenda for our open house this evening. We have lots of ground to cover in the next hour and a half or so, and we're glad you're able to join us. So as I said, I'll start off with a couple housekeeping items. I'll dive into the project purpose and background, and then my colleague, Bobby Gauthier at WSP, will go over just sort of a background into rural zoning and Kawartha Lakes today, a project status update, and as well as consultation update. We'll go over what's called the Assessment of Key Issues and Methodology report, and then we'll jump into a Q&A session followed by some next steps. And so that's just a brief agenda for tonight's session. And again, just a reminder, if you're able to stay on mute during the session, that would be greatly appreciated. So who's listening today? As I said, my name is Matt Rodriguez. I'm a planner at WSP, the consulting team working with the city on this project. And I'll pass the floor to Bobby Gauthier from WSP to introduce himself and then over to the city.
Sure, thanks, Matt. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you, great to be with you. My name is Bobby Gauthier. I'm a senior project manager at WSP. I'm the lead for the rural zoning bylaw review on the consulting team side, and looking forward to today's discussion. Thanks.
And over to you, John.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending this virtual open house pertaining to the rural zoning bylaw consolidation project. It has been quite the task we've been undertaking with Bobby and Matt. We're in very good hands with them as we move forward with this project. Just like to acknowledge the counselors that have attended this meeting with us. There's a lot of tiles to scroll through, so I would just like to say a blanket welcome to all of the counselors that have been in attendance with us tonight. And we look forward to spending the next hour and a half with you talking about the project.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good evening. My name is Richard Hawley. I'm the Acting Director of Development Services with the city. Thank you, Bobby and Matt, for putting together, and Jonathan for putting together this this virtual open house tonight. Really happy to see so many people that have chosen to join us tonight. It really shows that this platform, I think, is working, and it's certainly one of the larger open houses that I've experienced in my time here. Anyways, I'll turn the floor over to Matt as well. And so thank you. And we look forward to all of the discussions and questions with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And as Richard noted, yeah, this is fantastic turnout this evening, and we're really glad that everyone was able to join us. And so just before we jump into the meat and potatoes of this evening's presentation, just a few housekeeping items to go over on the Zoom platform. Again, we do ask that you remain muted until later on in the Q&A period when we will call on folks. And you know, that's just to help make sure we can all get a chance to speak. If you're experiencing any connection issues with the Zoom call, or you're having, you know, things are a little bit delayed, we recommend turning off your camera, as that sometimes can help with bandwidth. If you'd like to, please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to speak. We'll be getting to the sort of the speaking portion of the Q&A session at the end, but you're also welcome to type your question or comment in the chat box at any time. And so we'll be going through the chat box first once we get to the Q&A session, and going through those questions in the order they're received. And then we'll be jumping into anyone who'd like to perhaps speak over the phone. Given the number of community members in attendance this evening, we ask that you keep your comment to about 3 minutes or less. And as I said, you're welcome to use the chat box, which will be saved and recorded for future reference. So certainly nothing will be going into the void, so to speak, and we'll have a great record of all of that at the end of the session. And once we get to the end of the presentation, we'll also highlight other ways for you to share your input and feedback throughout the process if you're unable to share that this evening. So certainly lots more to come on this project, and we welcome everyone's participation this evening. On that note, I'm going to pass the floor over to Bobby Gauthier at WSP, who's going to walk through a presentation, and then we'll group back together for the Q&A. And as I said, feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box at any time. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt, for that intro. And I'll reiterate my thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I've similarly, like Richard, haven't had this many people attend a virtual open house. And I do think it speaks to the success of this kind of a format. So we hope it works out today, and we're interested in your feedback as well on the format. So what is the purpose of today's open house? There's a few things that we want to get at today. The first is we want to provide everyone with a clear update on the status of the Rural Zoning Bylaw Review project. We'll give you a sense of the timelines and the next steps. Secondly, we want to take this time to present a relatively new deliverable, the Assessment of Key Issues and Methodology report, which was posted on the website just a couple of months ago, or I think it was at the end of 2020. So we'll be doing a bit of an orientation to that deliverable. And then finally, we're looking to seek your input. You know, we're very much open to receiving comments on this project at any time. We look forward to your questions and your thoughts, your opinion, as we start to draft the zoning bylaw, or wrap up the draft of the zoning bylaw rather. So that's the purpose of today's open house. The purpose of the project overall, the Rural Zoning Bylaw Review, is fundamentally to develop and write a brand new zoning bylaw for what we call the rural areas of the city of Kawartha Lakes. I'll show you what that is on the next slide. If you're familiar at all with the zoning in Kawartha Lakes, you probably know very well that the city's rural areas are subject to 13 separate comprehensive zoning bylaws. So the city has to administer 13 bylaws, and I think is very keen on trying to consolidate them into one. So having one rural zoning bylaw is a key outcome and objective of this process. We're also going to be tasked with the need to implement the city's official plan. I'll talk about that later. It's an important point though, is that the zoning bylaw needs to align with the document described as the City of Kawartha Lakes official plan. Some people may know what that is, some people may not have heard of the official plan, but I'll give a bit more context later in the presentation. And then finally, ultimately, this is the opportunity to address other issues on the zoning. You know, if you have experience using the bylaw and you don't think it works well, you think it needs to be improved, you know, we're all ears on those kinds of comments and feedback. So we're looking to create a brand new modern rural zoning bylaw as part of this process. Next slide, Matt. So what is zoning? I do think before I dive too much into the process and sort of the weeds of the study, I do think it's beneficial to take just a minute and describe in a few words what zoning is exactly at a high level. So a zoning bylaw is a municipal bylaw. It's a bylaw that's passed and administered by the City of Kawartha Lakes, and it's a bylaw that fundamentally regulates the use of land. That's the first thing the zoning bylaw does. Zoning tells you not only what you can do with your property in terms of land use and activities, but it also describes the kinds of buildings and structures that you can have on your property and where they can be located on the property. We call those setbacks. So how far from the lot lines does a building need to be located? Those are the setbacks. The zoning bylaw tells you how tall your building can be. It has provisions around driveways, parking and loading, lot size, lot frontage, lot coverage. So zoning bylaws, suffice it to say, are very detailed bylaws, and they're very fundamental planning tools. They're also regulatory. So if someone contravenes the requirements of the zoning bylaw, they could be liable to a penalty in accordance with the Planning Act. Next slide, Matt. So what is the rural area? So the rural area, for the purposes of this project, is our study area. It's the area where we're going to be developing this new zoning bylaw. And the rural area does not cover the entire City of Kawartha Lakes. We do cover the great majority of it, though, in terms of land area. But there are a few areas of the city that are not going to be subject to this process. So the urban areas of Lindsay, Bobcaygeon, Fenelon Falls, Omemee, and Woodville are not part of this study area. And likewise, the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan area, it's a bit hard to see on the slide, but it's right at the bottom end of the City of Kawartha Lakes. That area is also not subject to this zoning review, but rather the city will be initiating another phase of the zoning bylaw review in which they're going to look at the urban zoning as well as the Oak Ridges Moraine zoning. So we're focusing on all the other areas of the city, which of course are highly diverse in nature. We're talking about hamlets, all kinds of little strips of residential uses, of agriculture-related uses, of agricultural uses, and certainly waterfront areas too. Next slide, Matt. So diving a little bit deeper into what the zoning looks like in the City of Kawartha Lakes today. So as I mentioned, we have 13 rural zoning bylaws. So currently the city has to administer 13 separate bylaws for all these areas. And you see them all listed on the slide. They were passed at different dates. Some of them are very similar in nature. Some of them are very different. So there's a lot to work through there. And then within those 13 rural zoning bylaws, there are 193 zone classifications. So there are 193 separately established zones. That includes, for example, 65 distinctive residential zones and so on and so forth, as you see listed on the slide. So there's lots of zones, and that kind of begs the question, is there opportunity to merge these zones? I think it's also important to point out that there are nearly 1,000 site-specific exception zones. So an exception zone is a zone passed by city council, usually as a result of a landowner initiated process. So they'll make an application to the city, and the city will make a determination as to whether it wishes to pass that bylaw or not. And if it does, it often becomes a site-specific zone. So over the years, the city's accumulated nearly 1,000 of them. And that's very normal. I've worked on other zoning bylaws that are in the multiple thousands. So 1,000 is not that bad, really. But it is quite a normal part of having and administering a zoning bylaw. And as part of this project, we're going to be looking to to review and update those site-specific exception zones. And I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, Matt. So in terms of the timeline and the process and the next steps, the work that's been done so far, the work that's underway, and the work that's going to be coming, I'll take a few minutes on this slide and go over all of those things. So at a high level, this project is a 3-stage process. We've completed stage 1. We consider that complete. That culminated in a presentation to council. Stage 1 involved the preparation of a discussion paper. You can still find the discussion paper on the city's website. Like I said, we're always open to comments and input as we move forward. But the discussion paper was brought to the public for consultation in the fall of 2019. And then we brought that to council for endorsement early in 2020. And then we initiated stage 2 after that presentation to council. And stage 2 consists of a couple of major deliverables. The first is the issues and methodology report, which is what we're here today to present on. That's really the focus of this presentation. And then there's also drafting the zoning bylaw, which of course is really the key outcome of this whole process. So we've completed the issues and methodology report in draft. It's been posted on the city's website, and now we're here to consult and obtain some input on that. And while we're doing that, we're also drafting. We're proceeding to draft the zoning bylaw. And in terms of next steps, our intent would be to release the draft zoning bylaw for public review in about early June of this year. So just in a couple of months from now, you can expect to see the draft zoning bylaw come out for public input. Over the course of the summer and the fall, we'll move into stage 3. So once the draft zoning bylaw has been released, we'll do a whole bunch of consultation. I'll talk about that a bit later, but we'll finalize and refine the bylaw over the course of the summer and the fall with the intent of bringing that forward for council's consideration to adopt by the end of this year is the target, but it may have to proceed into early next year, sort of depending on the extent of comments that we receive. So that's sort of the timeline in a nutshell. And as you see on the slide, of course, there was a project pause. So the project was paused by the city between April and October of 2020, and that just relates to COVID and resourcing and other considerations on the city's end. So, but we're now reinitiated and moving forward very quickly. The city's pretty eager to get this project done for a lot of reasons. You know, we got to make sure we're doing it right. But you know, I think the city is getting a little bit exhausted administering 13 separate bylaws. So there's a fair bit of eagerness to move forward. Next slide, Matt. So that's the process as a whole, but diving a little bit deeper into some of the consultation activities. So I'll kind of go over some of the consultation activities we've completed already, and I'll provide a bit of an overview of what everyone can expect to see in the coming months. So what we've completed so far, the first main thing was a series of open houses. I think we actually had 4 open houses, if I'm not mistaken, in September of 2019. And we got to the public and we presented the discussion paper back when we were able to have in-person open houses. Had lots of great attendance, by the way, at those meetings as well. On the basis of that, we finalized our discussion paper, presented to council. You know, throughout this process too, we've been meeting with the task force. So a task force has been set up and established by council, and the task force consists of a range of different community representatives, as well as members of council who are there to guide and to steer the process. That's the purpose of the task force. So they're involved in a very regular basis. We also have a technical advisory committee. So we have a committee of different agencies, conservation authorities, neighboring municipalities and the planners that work there. You know, different utility companies are part of that technical advisory committee, and they're there to give us technical advice. They're there to point us in the right direction and help us to understand their interests in this process. Over the last few weeks, we've also had a couple of workshops with key stakeholders. So people that have specifically expressed some interest in a couple of key topics. We've conducted a couple of open houses, or rather a couple of workshop events with them. And we're going to be talking about some of those topics today as part of this presentation. So that's sort of an overview of what's been done so far, but what's coming up? A few key things. The first is that in about late June, we're going to be conducting again a series of open houses once the draft zoning bylaw has been released for public review. So once that draft bylaw is out there, we're going to have a series of meetings to give people an orientation to that document. I think that's going to be really key. You know, in my experience on these processes, people become very, very keen and interested on seeing that draft zoning bylaw. So we expect, although participation has been amazing, I would expect participation will probably ramp up starting in June. We'll continue to meet with the task force and the technical advisory committee. We've also been working with the city, and the city's launched a new project website, and we'll have a look at the link a bit later. And finally, we'll have to have some other consultation. As we refine the bylaw, we're going to go back to the public and at least conduct a public open house and a statutory public meeting. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide too is that I think to an extent we're nimble and we're open. You know, things have changed. The pandemic has changed the nature of this process and the consultation that we're conducting. So I think the team is pretty open to ideas and thoughts as to how to best engage the community. So if you have thoughts on that, we're very much open to that too. You know, our focus is on getting as much input as we can, because the more input we get, the better this bylaw is going to be. Next slide, please. So in terms of the work completed to date, I've kind of gone over this a little bit already, but just as a little bit of a refresher and to put it into some other words. So there's been 2 major reports completed, as well as those open houses. So the discussion paper, like I said, was the first major deliverable produced back at the end of 2019. And the discussion paper, it's a bit of a higher level document. It gives a summary of the key policy and the legislation. And it also starts to identify what are the key issues with the current zoning bylaw. So in other words, the discussion paper, it's kind of our first cut at the work plan for developing the new draft zoning bylaw. And you'll find some principles for writing the bylaw in that document as well. Conducted the open houses. I mentioned, you know, they were very well attended. We presented the discussion paper and received a lot of feedback, which we'll keep considering as we move forward in the process. The new key deliverable that we've relatively recently produced is the issues and methodology report. So this is quite a key document. I'll go over some of the content as part of this presentation, but the main point of this document is that when we produced the discussion paper, we kind of realized that, you know, there were a few key issues that required more research. They required more thought. And in particular, when we went out to the community and to present the discussion paper, I was really surprised. A lot of members of the public were quite interested in understanding more specifically, how are we going to merge 13 zoning bylaws? Like, what's going to be the decision-making process that goes into that? And that's what the issues and methodology report does. It really lays out the steps involved in this consolidation in very clear detail. So it's kind of an interesting report if you're interested in those kinds of details. And of course, the other key deliverable in this project would be the draft zoning bylaw, which will be coming out, like I said, in early June. Next slide, Matt. Okay. I've mentioned at least a couple of times in this presentation that one of our key responsibilities in this process is to make sure that the zoning bylaw conforms to the City of Kawartha Lakes official plan. In fact, that's a legislated requirement. The Planning Act requires that the zoning be reviewed and updated to conform to the city's official plan. So what is the official plan? I can definitely appreciate some people might, you might have heard of zoning, but maybe not the official plan. The official plan is a very key planning document that the city administers. It's really the city's broad strategy for managing growth, land use, and development applications. So whenever the city receives a development application, it's evaluated against the policies of the official plan. The zoning bylaw is the key vehicle to implement the official plan. And that means that the zoning bylaw needs to be well aligned with the policies of the plan. So the official plan is kind of high level. It contains these what are called land use designations. And it says, generally speaking, this is what's permitted and what's not permitted in each of the land use designations. The zoning bylaw takes that and it drills down into a lot of detail. So it takes those high level permissions and requirements and it lays it out in much more detail. What I like to tell people, when people say, well, what does it mean to conform to the official plan? I don't understand what that means. That's a very jargony term. I think the way I would describe it to people is that the zoning bylaw, generally speaking, cannot be more permissive than the official plan. So if the official plan prohibits a certain use in an area, then the zoning bylaw can no longer permit that use in that area. There may be some existing ones which are perfectly legal and continue to operate, but moving forward, the city would not be able to continue to permit them if it's not permitted in the official plan anymore. So that's why we're reviewing the zoning bylaw against the official plan. Next slide, Matt. Another task on our list, not that we're short of tasks on this list, but one thing we have to do is align with other city initiatives. The city of Kawartha Lakes is a very, very busy municipality. They're always doing different kinds of studies, and they're updating their policies, they're updating their zoning. You know, planning is a very rapidly evolving kind of world to operate in. And 3 studies that the city's completed recently include updated policies and zoning for source water protection for additional residential units, which are like, you know, basement apartments and things like that, as well as zoning and policy provisions related to cannabis cultivation and production and processing uses. So these are 3 initiatives the city's been moving forward on recently, and we're going to be weaving in the recommendations of these studies into the new zoning bylaw. That would be our intent. And if the city has other studies that are ongoing that are relevant to our process, we'll make sure that we're aligned with those as well. Next slide, Matt. So this takes me to, I don't want to say the second half of the presentation. I think I'm more than halfway through it, but I think the bulk of the content of the presentation. So far I've been going over background, timeline, process, what is zoning, and that sort of thing. And I want to turn now to the issues and methodology report. So the issues and methodology report is our latest key deliverable. And it's a document, like I said earlier, that builds on the first discussion paper, and it dives deeper into a few very key topics that we know are going to be really fundamental to the success of this process. So those topics are listed on the slide. And this isn't to suggest that these are the only things we're doing in the zoning bylaw. It certainly isn't. Our list of tasks and the work that we have to do on the zoning bylaw is very extensive. But these, I would characterize these are probably the 5 really fundamental key things that people are going to be interested in. So we'll walk through those on the subsequent slides. So the first one is this notion of consolidating the zoning bylaws. And this is a pretty fundamental thing. This is a significant part of the work involved in developing the new rural zoning bylaw. So as I said earlier, the city's been administering 13 bylaws. It has to administer close to 200 zones. And a very key objective of this project is to bring forward those bylaws into one and to harmonize them and simplify them to the extent possible. There's a lot of benefits to that. So it'll bring about greater consistency across the city. I think there's probably been some frustration from landowners who, maybe they're not allowed to do something, but their neighbor is, because, they're subject to different bylaws. So we want to bring about more equity and fairness within the bylaw. This report, I would say, ultimately addresses how we're going to do the consolidation. So we're not proposing the new zones in the report, but the report outlines in a lot of detail what are the steps involved in consolidating the zones and reducing them. So some of the key principles that I think are worth mentioning for everyone, even though this is sort of in the weeds on the details, the principles I think are important. So number one is we want to bring about consistency and eliminate duplication. There's no reason to have multiple zones that are saying the same thing, essentially. We can certainly bring them together. We want to simplify and modernize the names of uses. So we want to really bring about a much more modern approach to the way uses are being defined and addressed in the bylaw. We also have to make sure we're being consistent with the official plan, like I've said. And I also think it's an important consideration that our intent is to minimize reductions to private property entitlement to the extent we can in the context of the official plan. So for the most part, our intent would be to carry forward existing permissions as much as we can, but as I've mentioned, we'll have to make sure that that's still in alignment with the official plan. Now, the chart on the screen is obviously kind of a complex drawing. You may not be able to see the details, but suffice it to say, I think what the diagram is showing is what the steps are involved in order to bring the zones together and to compare them and to make some decisions about when they're similar enough that they can actually be merged. As I said, I think this topic is probably in the weeds for a lot of people, but when we were at the open houses in the fall of 2019, there was quite a bit of interest expressed from people in seeing how this was laid out. So if you do have interest in this, if you turn to the issues and methodology report, you'll see this all fleshed out in detail. Next slide, Matt. And I should say too that, you know, we've been working on the draft zoning bylaw. It's coming out in a couple of months, and the early signs suggest we can probably reduce the number of zones by a good 3/4 or something like that. So on this slide, this is kind of building on the last slide. So we also need to be thinking about how are we going to review those site-specific exception zones. I mentioned that there's nearly 1,000 of them that the city has passed over the years, as is normal. You know, they process development applications and they implement the outcome of that decision as a site-specific zone. We've created, as part of the issues and discussion and methodology report, we've created the process for reviewing and updating those site-specific exception zones. And again, this might be a little bit in the weeds for a lot of people, but I think if you have a property that has a site-specific zone, this might be something of interest to you. Suffice it to say, I think our intent overall is to largely carry forward these permissions, but we will absolutely have to make sure that these permissions, A, still line up with the official plan, and B, they still fit within the new parent bylaw. I would expect that we'll be able to delete a lot of the exceptions just on the basis that the new updated modern bylaw simply permits what the exception was trying to permit in the first place. So if that's the case, you don't need the exception and we can delete it. Now, there may be other exceptions we'll want to consider removing on the basis that the use has discontinued. You know, the exception is very old, it was passed many decades ago, and it's just not needed anymore. So that's another reason why we might delete some exceptions, but I would expect we'll likely retain a lot of them. Next slide, Matt. Okay, got about, just so people are aware, we've got about 10 minutes left on the presentation. So another one of the key issues that the issues and methodology report dives into is this idea of regulating uses and development in the waterfront areas of the city. So the city's official plan includes pretty important policies that are aimed at, you know, protecting the character and the health and the quality of the water amongst the city's many rivers and lakes. And in particular, if you look at the official plan, you'll find that there are some specific policies related to this waterfront designation, which generally permits, you know, certain amount of residential development subject to criteria, but it also has criteria that I think can be effectively considered in the zoning bylaw. So for example, the official plan generally requires that new homes be set back a minimum of 30 meters from the shoreline. And that's not something that the zoning bylaws, like the existing 13 rural zoning bylaws, are doing much about. The official plan also talks about, you know, there's a need to help restore and naturalize the shoreline. And it kind of begs the question, is the zoning bylaw a tool that can help support that policy? So our ultimate dilemma here is that the official plan is saying certain things and directing certain things, but the current zoning bylaws aren't really doing much about them just because they're older than the official plan. Next slide, Matt. So we've put some thought into, and you'll see this in the report. Again, you know, this may not be a topic that's of interest to everyone, but I'd imagine a lot of people are interested in this topic. But if you look at the report, you'll find that we've outlined a range of different zoning tools and options that can support the implementation of some of those policies. So for example, we can include zoning regulations that require shoreline naturalization. And we've certainly seen some other zoning bylaws in Ontario that include those kinds of requirements. And then it kind of you know, begs the question also. So if the zoning bylaw is requiring shoreline naturalization, well, when does that apply? Should that only apply to new dwellings? Can it apply retroactively? And what's sort of the extent of those provisions? So you'll see some different options and information about the details in the report. And then obviously, as we flesh out the draft bylaw, we'll keep building on that. There's another option is that we can include zoning regulations for an established building line. So an established building line is basically to allow infilling to happen in line with your sort of adjacent neighbors. So if your neighbors are at a certain distance from the shoreline, an established building line provision would allow you to kind of line up the dwellings in spite of another setback requirement. So, we have to ask the question, is this appropriate in Kawartha Lakes? Is this the approach that we want to take, or do we want to be a lot more firm about the waterfront setbacks? We're also looking at provisions to regulate shoreline structures like docks, boathouses, sheds and things like that, storage things. So, and there's a wide range of different options on that. There's almost an endless range of different options as to how we could craft those provisions. So there could be a maximum number of those kinds of structures. There could be maximum coverage requirements that limit how much of your lot is covered by these structures. There could also be a maximum cumulative width requirement where the total width of the structures can't exceed a certain amount relative to the frontage of your lot on water. So lots of different options for provisions there. We have to be implementing the official plan's minimum 30-meter setback requirement, and that's pretty key, especially on a go-forward basis. But we also have to remember that there are some existing dwellings that likely were built, perfectly legally in accordance with the rules at the time that don't meet that 30-meter requirement in the official plan anymore, because the official plan is newer than the dwelling is. So, we have some discretion. We need to be thinking about, well, if there's an existing house that doesn't meet that 30-meter setback requirement, then should they be allowed to expand their dwelling? Or should they be highly restricted in terms of their expansion ability? Or if they do expand, is there some criteria that we can establish, like shoreline naturalization, in sort of an exchange, quote unquote, for allowing a minor expansion? So suffice to say, there's a lot of different zoning options and tools that we can use to support the policies of the official plan for the waterfront areas. We're very interested in hearing from the public as to sort of your thoughts on some of these different provisions and tools and the challenges or the benefits involved in them. Just checking my notes here, sorry. Yeah, I do think overall, this is a very key topic in the zoning bylaw review. So, we want to make sure that we're going to get these provisions for the waterfront areas right. It may not be of interest to everyone on this call at this point, but if it is something of interest, we certainly encourage that, you check out the issues and methodology report on this topic, and we very much welcome and encourage your feedback on this one. This is definitely something that we want to get right. Next slide, Matt. So moving on, just about 5 minutes left in the presentation. So waterfront areas are one key issue. Another one are the agricultural areas of the city. And there's a couple of sort of subtopics that are addressed in the issues and methodology report. And the first one pertains to agriculture-related uses. So agriculture-related uses are those uses that are related to surrounding farm operations. And they're there to facilitate services generally to the rural area. So it includes things like feed mills, abattoirs, like slaughterhouses, auction establishments, those kinds of things that are serving the broader agricultural community. So our intent, based on the report, and again, that this is an issue that interests you, you'll want to look at it, but our report is essentially recommending at this point that we make sure that we're carrying forward permissions for any existing ones, because if they were legally established, we should certainly retain that and recognize that. For any new agriculture-related uses, the intent would be that a new one would have to go through a planning process. They'd have to get a zoning bylaw amendment, and that's in order to assess and make sure that it meets the requirements of the official plan. So in order to establish a brand new agriculture-related use, a zoning amendment's required. And that really comes from provincial policy. Provincial policy is quite, as I'm sure many people on the call know, is quite restrictive, and especially in prime agricultural areas. And there's significant restriction in terms of creating lots and establishing uses that are not simply farms and aren't simply normal farming kind of activities. Anything else has to go through a process to make sure that it meets those provincial requirements, excuse me. So I think that's it for that one, Matt. Next slide, please. On-farm diversified uses. So an on-farm diversified use refers to an accessory use, a secondary use to a main farm or agricultural use on a property. So this isn't about creating new lots or new development per se. It's more about giving farmers a bit of opportunity to do something on their property that can help the viability of their farming operation. And they may or may not be directly related to what's being grown on the land. So we have an opportunity as the report, again, if you're interested in this piece, you'll want to check out the report, but the report suggests that we can look at permitting these uses as of right. So we can establish a new framework in the zoning bylaw that allows farmers to have a little bit more flexibility around their uses. And we'll of course have to establish criteria around on-farm diversified uses. So they won't be permitted totally as of right. They'll have to meet certain criteria, which might include things like minimum lot area, special setback requirements to make sure that the rural character is being maintained. And certainly there's going to have to be a requirement surrounding maximum lot coverage, because an on-farm diversified use can only take up a certain portion of the property in accordance with provincial policy. So that's another key topic that you'll see in the issues and methodology report. Next slide, Matt. So the report also dives into the topic of environmental protection. And at least it gets at a couple of items, not necessarily comprehensively, but at a couple of items. So the first is, we've been thinking about what should be the role of the zoning bylaw when it comes to floodplains, hazardous lands, when it comes to steep slopes, things like that. And one of the recommendations in the issues and methodology report is that we illustrate the regulation limit of the conservation authorities as an overlay on the schedule. And the intent of that would be mainly a convenience feature. It would tell people that, hey, you might need a permit from the conservation authority because you're in an area that is regulated by the conservation authority, whether that be a wetland or whether that be an area that is prone to flooding hazards. So that's one of the outcomes and recommendations of the paper when it comes to implementing the official plans policies for natural hazard protection. The second sort of subtopic in the report on this overall topic is, what about the natural heritage system? What about all of the woodlands and the wetlands? All the sensitive features throughout the city. What should be the role of this new zoning bylaw to help protect those? And there's a couple of points to be made there. I think the overarching outcome of the report, at least as a preliminary recommendation, is we'll be looking to carry forward existing environmental protection zoning, as opposed to doing a fulsome update based on the OP. And one of the reasons for that is, if we want to delineate features and zone them highly for protection, there needs to be a very strong basis to do that. There needs to be really detailed data, and there also needs to be recommendations around what should be the setbacks from that feature, what should be the protective buffers around the feature. And you can only really assess that when you look at the feature in detail, because it is feature specific. So what we're recommending is we'll carry forward the zoning, but if we can find site-specific detailed mapping that's more accurate than what's there now, then we should be considering updates to it. And some of that updated mapping may exist in the form of recent exception zones that have been passed, but there may also be good data available from the province or other sources that can help us with this task. In particular, we're wondering if potentially the provincially significant wetlands, like the wetlands that the province protects, the big ones, the province has really good mapping for those. So there could be quite an opportunity, I think, to delineate and to protect the wetlands using that really good data. Next slide, Matt. So the final item, just wrapping up the presentation in a couple of minutes, the final key item that you'll find in that report relates to the layout and the template for the zoning bylaw. So we wanted to give people a sense of what we were thinking in terms of what the zoning bylaw is going to look like, but also how is it going to be organized. And fundamentally, what we're recommending is a much more modern looking zoning bylaw, something that uses different convenience features to make the bylaw easier to use and to read. I'll highlight those very briefly. One thing that we find quite helpful is to define or to underline terms that have been defined in the bylaw. If you've used a zoning bylaw before, you know just how important the definitions are in interpreting what you're reading. And so it's a pretty extraordinarily convenient thing when the terms that are defined are underlined. It just tells you, hey, there's a definition here. We'll be looking to organize the bylaw into distinctive zone sections. So instead of having a separate chapter for every single zone, to the extent we can, we're going to merge some of the provisions. So we might have a single chapter for the residential zones, or maybe a single chapter for hamlet zones or something along that of that nature. We're looking to use tables and matrices in this bylaw as well. So as a means of better organizing and presenting information and allowing information to be compared. So a good example that you see on the screen, which by the way is just a hypothetical shot of the zoning bylaw. That's not the recommended or draft zoning bylaw, just sort of a placeholder. What you can see is that the permitted use tables are sort of listed as a matrix. And what that does is it allows you to compare the zones. So, you know, if you want to build a feed mill, what zone category do you need? You can find that very easily when it's organized into a table. We'll use easy to read fonts, accessible layouts. We'll meet all those different accessibility standards from that perspective. We're also recommending that the exception zones be organized into a distinctive separate chapter. I think currently in the zoning bylaws, the exception zones are organized into the zone chapters themselves. But given that there's almost 1,000, given that we're kind of merging these bylaws together, I think it makes a lot of sense to put the exceptions into one single chapter, so it's a lot easier to find. Next slide, Matt. So that's the presentation. So today's presentation, I've gone over information about the status and the timeline, and just to recap that, our current ongoing, not next step, but our ongoing step would be to continue to draft the zoning bylaw and also to receive feedback. So feedback from this open house, if you want to ponder some of the things I'm saying and get back to us, later on in the future, then we'd certainly welcome your input at that point, at any time really. And we'll keep plugging away on the draft bylaw. The intent, like I said, is to release the draft bylaw by early June of this year, and it'll pop up online. If you've registered, then you should receive a notice as well. And then in June, we'll be conducting consultations. So we'll host a series of meetings in order to orient people to the draft bylaw, so to speak, and provide a bit of overarching narrative around it and help people with their review of the document. So that concludes the next steps. So how to participate? Again, we certainly encourage and welcome all the input we can get. If you go to jumpinkawarthalakes.ca, you'll find that this is really the landing page for the project. So if you head over to that website and scroll down a bit, you'll see a link to Rural Zoning Bylaw Review. When you click on that link, it'll take you to our landing page, and you'll be able to download all of the materials. So I've mentioned the key issues and methodology report. It's certainly on there, as well as the previous discussion paper and all of the consultation materials. I think our intent also is or we certainly could post a recording of this open house on the website or on another platform. So, and there's also a link to register to receive information. You'll also find different fields. There's an FAQ document. There's opportunities to provide input. It's very much a centralized kind of landing page. And we also, of course, invite you to contact John. John, who introduced himself earlier, is still on the line and happy to take your inquiries as we move forward in the process. So with that, Matt, I will turn it back to you and we can start with Q&A. Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right, thanks so much, Bobby, and thanks so much, everyone, for keeping the chat box alive as we went through the presentation. It's great to see folks engaged in the topic. So I'm going to start at the top and work through these questions, sort of one by one. And if there's some common threads, I'll try and stitch them together. Some of the questions were sent to me, I guess, directly, so I will read out the question before I pass it off to someone, and I'll pass the question to either John or Bobby or Richard to provide an answer. So again, feel free to keep typing those questions in the chat box. If you're still experiencing any connection issues, feel free to turn off your camera or turn that back on. And then at the end, once we get to the chat box, we'll give an opportunity for folks to raise their hand. And if they have any questions they'd like to speak to, you're certainly welcome to do that at that time. So the first question, and I'll jump right in, is, and Bobby just mentioned this, will there be a copy of this on YouTube? And Bobby alluded to this, we will be posting a recording of this video and of all the Q&A on Jump in Kawartha Lakes, and so you'll be able to view that at a later date. And this is perhaps a question to Bobby. Is there an analysis that's been completed that shows the proportion of different zones across the city?
That's a great question. I thought I might be remembering wrong, Matt, but I think the discussion paper includes a bit more assessment, or maybe it's the issues and methodology report that includes a breakdown. Yeah, so our original discussion paper, which you can find on the website, should have sort of a breakdown of the zoning. So it'll tell you, what percentage of the land area in the city is zoned by different zone categories.
Great, thanks, Bobby. The next question is a bit trickier, and I don't think we have the answer to it, but city staff might be able to point us somewhere. What is the population of each zone? I don't think that is calculated or able to be calculated, but perhaps I'll pass that to the city or Bobby to take a stab at.
I mean, it's certainly something to take away. I think what would be actually, I think to some extent you could almost infer that from the analysis of land area composition. It may be something we have to take away and get back to the person on, but suffice it to say, if I'm recalling correctly, the discussion paper might even tell you how many properties are zoned within each zone category, which can kind of give you a sense of how many people might be living there. So, for example, if X properties are zoned R1, you can kind of glean X times X people per unit would give you a general sense of the population. But I think it's something we might have to take away, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Bobby. And Bobby, again, will the draft bylaw, when we go out to the public with it, will that include an analysis of the delta, or I guess the differences and changes between the existing zoning bylaws and the proposed rural zoning bylaw?
That's an excellent question. It's a bit hard to do that because going from 13 bylaws to 1, there are a number of steps involved in which we're going to merge the zones and also kind of go through different iterations of it. It'll be a little bit hard to track that specifically. But I think this is something we can take away, because I'm very much a big proponent of trying to communicate the changes to people clearly, because I often find that's really what people are interested in. How did the zoning for my property change? So I think what I'll do, Matt, is I'll make a point to take that one away, and we can start to think about how can we best communicate those changes to people. I think at a minimum, I'm very amenable. So we've done a lot of background work in terms of the analysis to consolidate the zones, as Matt will know. These very large Excel tables where we're comparing the different zones and we're making some decisions. And I'm amenable to publishing and producing that information online if we can get it into a nice cleaned up format for people to understand. The other thing I'll point out too, just to help answer that question, is that the methodology report was really explicit about the thresholds for when we'll merge the zones. So it was very clear about when the zones are similar enough, when can we bring them together? So that, I think I'd be quite interested in comments from the public as to whether those thresholds make sense or not. Are they a bit too tight, or can we loosen things up a bit and merge the zones even more? So I think to help answer the question about sort of the delta, the changes, I think that can help to shed some light on that question.
Thanks, Bobby. And yeah, just I guess building on that, there was a sort of a question that came in and any chance to see that Excel spreadsheet. And I think, to Bobby's comment, he said, we can take that away, see if we can clean that up or, provide it in a sort of a summary. It's a bit color coded and all over the, trying to make sense of all the data and make sure we're getting it all right. So I think if we're able to clean it up and talk to city staff, I think there's an opportunity there. Okay, just going to scroll back up here. So I guess a question, and city staff might chime in at this. Is there an expected, or is there any influence on the urban areas, and when will those be reconciled, or when will those be reviewed?
I can take a stab at to start that one out, Matt. I would say this process wouldn't have any influence on what the official plan calls the urban areas. So that would be the ones that I listed in the presentation. So Bobcaygeon, Lindsay, Omemee, and Woodville. I might be missing one.
And Fenelon Falls.
Fenelon.
Oh, and Fenelon Falls. So I would say this process has really no influence. Like, those areas are totally out of our study area. We're not touching the zoning. As to the timing of reviewing them, I think maybe John would be better able to speak to that.
And I will graciously pass that timing question to Richard.
Yes, thank you. So as many people may be aware, we're working on our secondary plans right now for Lindsay, Bobcaygeon, Fenelon Falls, Woodville, and Omemee. Those are in front of the LPAT right now, what used to be known as the OMB. Once those are finished and finalized and they're all approved by the LPAT, then we're going to start the work on doing the zoning bylaw updates. There's really no point in starting that work now before the final land use decisions have been made. So, but once that is finished, then we will start working on that, which is I sort of look at as phase 2 of the zoning bylaw project. It will be a similar project as what we're doing here in terms of a process perspective, but I'm guessing that'll probably start, I would think, in probably about 2 years' time. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think that's helpful, Richard. Thanks so much. I'm going to stitch together 2 questions here. So one, and it's been a little while since we've met with them, so we might miss a couple groups here, but can we know a little bit more about the expertise represented on the technical advisory committee? And I guess there was a follow-up question, and I'll just stitch it in. Will the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association be consulted as part of the technical advisory committee?
I can jump in on that. Certainly, we have our agricultural liaison, Kelly Maloney. She is with the city. She's our agricultural expert, and she's very heavily involved as part of the technical review committee. Obviously, I think we will be looking to her expertise on some of the matters. I think, though, that's probably going to be more of a question when we do our agricultural land analysis over the next year. That's one of the things that we have to do. The province issued agricultural land mapping, and we have to refine that for our use and put that into our official plan. And I think that's probably where we're going to get more into the question of soils and soil capabilities when we go to define the different land classifications within the official plan. So I don't think that we're going to be doing as much through the zoning bylaw, but we'll certainly be looking at that through our agricultural land analysis.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I see Bobby's come off mute, so I'll pass it maybe to you to round out that question.
Sure, I was just going to chime in on sort of the first half. I agree with Richard about the soils consideration and sort of the role of that group. I think is probably more relevant to the city's official plan than this process, because we take our direction from the official plan. The first part of the question was, what is sort of the different expertise involved in that technical committee? And I think we might have to take that away. I was trying to pull up the list really quickly so I could run through it with you, but I'm having some issues with Outlook at the moment, so I missed it. But off the top of my head, there's a great group of people, and I think there's probably about 20 people that attended. We haven't met with them in some time, but we've got representation from the conservation authorities. We've got the local, like the neighboring municipalities. We've had representatives from each one of those. We've had various utility companies. I know MTO, the Ministry of Transportation, the province is on the committee. A couple utility companies. I don't know, John, if there's any others that I'm missing that come to mind for you.
There were a few other internal departments, like engineering and building. We're also on that. Somebody from economic development on that technical advisory committee as well. Other municipalities, MTO. I think there was somebody from MMAH on there as well. A few of the ministries on that committee. Like you said, we haven't met with them in some time, so I'd be sending that away.
Yeah, and I think it's a fluid group of people, right, John? It's not the set in stone thing. We can't change it. If we want to involve other agencies because we think it's a good idea, we can certainly do that at any time, right?
Absolutely. That list is fluid. We've had even, members internal to those agencies rotate out due to different assignments or whatnot. So yes, we can continue adding to that for sure.
Okay, thanks both. I'm going to move on. And I guess, thanks, John provided a great response. As Bobby mentioned it early on, we are looking to adapt the consultation and engagement approach as the public health guidelines evolve and, as the project, as we ensure that we're communicating what we need to for the project. So, our hope is to provide as many options for people and to certainly take feedback. So if you do have comments or suggestions, we're certainly happy to consider that for future events. Bobby, I'll pass this one to you. The question is, how many existing properties, and this is probably a bit hard to know, but how many existing properties will be non-conforming to any new proposed bylaw, and in particular the waterfront that couldn't be conforming due to lot configuration?
I think we'll get a better sense of that once the draft bylaw is completed. We'll have a much clearer answer as to those instances where we've changed permissions for people. I think suffice it to say, we're trying to minimize that. The only reason why we're going to reduce permissions is to take direction and implement what's permitted by the official plan. And I think for the most part, that's likely going to relate to the agricultural areas and those associated policies. I'll say also, we will be looking to include provisions related to legal nonconformity and legal noncompliance. So the bylaw will, at least in draft, I think, will probably recognize those uses and allow legal nonconforming uses to expand. And similarly, I think if we create a legal non-complying situation, I should pull back a bit on the jargon here. Let me give an example. So if there's say a waterfront dwelling, and they want to, or suppose there's an existing dwelling on a waterfront lot, and for some reason we've changed the bylaw and we've modified the setback. So maybe the setback used to be minimum 3 meters, and now we've changed it to minimum 4.5 meters. So we've increased the required setback and we've rendered that dwelling legal non-compliant. We're gonna minimize when that happens, but if it does happen, it shouldn't be very impactful to a house because it'll still allow the house to continue. It'll be sort of grandfathered, and it'll even allow the house to expand just as long as it doesn't further contravene that legal non-complying situation. So our intent in a nutshell is to minimize legal non-conformity and legal non-compliance. But when there is, we're going to have some provisions around that for sure. So we'll be very thoughtful about that. That's a very key point and a really good question.
Thanks so much, Bobby. And I can potentially feel the next question is just a question about how will the bylaw review be aligned with the Kawartha Lakes Healthy Environment Plan, particularly in regards to agricultural land use. And that was something that was discussed in the discussion paper. So if you do flip to the discussion paper, there is a brief discussion around the Kawartha Lakes Healthy Environment Plan, and we'll be looking at that as we go through the bylaw. I'll pass the next question to Bobby, and city staff may weigh in as well. Are the DP areas or development plan areas of the official plan an example of site-specific exceptions, and how will they be treated in the new bylaw?
It's a great question. The DP areas, I think, refer to a policy area that's in the official plan and includes some policies around that area. I wouldn't call that a site-specific exception zone because it's not in the zoning bylaw. It's an official plan matter. However, to implement DP areas, we might need to create a site-specific exception zone. I think that's a great point. Whenever there's policies that apply to a certain piece of land, you usually have to address that with a specific zone and specific requirements. So, like I keep saying in the presentation, what's really key for us is to implement the official plan. We have to make sure the new zoning bylaw meets those policies. So if the official plan is saying something about these DP areas, we got to make sure that the zoning bylaw is consistent with that. And I completely agree with the point that the right mechanism to do that may be for us to create a site-specific exception zone.
Thanks, Bobby. I feel like we might be moving quick, but we have lots of questions to get through, and we just want to make sure everyone gets them in. So if anyone has any follow-ups, we're happy to take those offline. Next question for Bobby is, if a current zone conflicts with a feature where development is prohibited, such as a significant woodland or wetland, would the environmental protection goals of the OP trump the zone? If I interpreted that question correctly.
That's such a good question. Yeah, it's well worded, and it's really getting at, I think, a fundamental aspect of this bylaw and how it relates to the official plan. So I'm glad you raised it because it lets me elaborate on stuff in the presentation. So suffice it to say, I would say they're kind of different tools, and they get triggered at different times. So the zoning is fundamentally the applicable law on a property, in addition to whatever other laws might apply. So generally speaking, if you have a zone that allows you, say, to build a single detached house, you can still do that in spite of what the official plan says.
Everyone can just remain on mute. That'd be fantastic. Thanks so much.
So yeah, if your zoning allows for something, that's really the applicable law. You can proceed with that. Now, the official plan, though, it contains policies, as you've mentioned, surrounding environmental protection. And those policies are triggered by all kinds of different processes. So generally speaking, let me put it this way, if the project requires a change to the zoning, so if the landowner wants to do something that's not permitted by the zoning, they'll have to go through a zoning amendment process. And through the zoning amendment process, the city will apply the policies of the official plan when it comes to environmental protection. So the city will say, hey, you need to do a study. You want to get a zoning amendment, you got to do a study first, delineate the natural features, and then you can proceed with development. The city can also implement the policies. If a zoning amendment's not required, it can do that through other processes. Like, for example, as part of a site plan application, which is a different kind of application that might be required. And then through subdivisions. So if someone's proposing multiple lots and have to go through a plan of subdivision process, then the city, that would also trigger the need to do an environmental review of the lands and to implement the policies of the official plan. So suffice it to say, I think in a nutshell, the zoning is the applicable law. The official plan itself is not law. You don't have to meet it like it was law, but the city will apply the official plan whenever a Planning Act application is triggered. I'm not sure if maybe the city want to just elaborate on any of that, or correct me if I've said something wrong there.
No, I think you've captured it, Bobby. Obviously, the official plan does provide the overall policy guidance, but when you really look at what's allowed allowed to be developed on a piece of property, is certainly the zoning that carries the weight. And even right now, in some instances, we have zoning bylaws or zones that don't quite conform to the official plan. Notwithstanding that, whatever is in the zoning bylaw is what's allowed to be developed. So yes, at the end of the day, the zoning bylaw is really the document that everyone looks towards when they're looking at uses or developing property. So without unless they go through a subdivision process or something like that. So yes, that's a good explanation.
Thanks, Richard. And I'm going to keep you on the spot for a double whammy question. So will the process to work through a zoning bylaw amendment be streamlined or modernized sort of concurrently to the zoning bylaw review? A couple questions to that effect. Yeah.
That's a good question. We are looking at ways to sort of help to streamline the process. Obviously, there are requirements that we have to follow under the Planning Act. That's what gives us the authority to process zoning bylaws and zoning bylaw amendments. There are minimum requirements that are put in that legislation to deal with zoning applications. But I mean, I think part of it is also that trying to look at our processes to see where we can maybe improve that. I think that's that's something that we're always looking at. However, there is a minimum timeline that is required. So to answer the question, we couldn't just approve a zoning bylaw amendment in 2 weeks. Wish we could some days, but that's just not the case. There are requirements for public consultation, which we do have to do for all applications. And we also have to talk to all the different agencies to see what they have to say. And obviously the public has a say in it. And that process does unfortunately take some time. So there is only a limited amount of latitude that we have for that.
Thanks, Richard. Bobby, did you have anything to weigh in on that one?
I was just going to add just a brief point there, Matt, is that the fact that there's going to be a new zoning bylaw developed, I think should decrease the number of applications the city should have to deal with. And in particular, although this isn't related to a landowner initiated process, but when the city wants to amend its bylaws, it's going to be a lot simpler now. Right now, when the city wants to make even just a small housekeeping amendment to its bylaws, it has to go through and amend 13 separate ones, which is quite an onerous thing to do. So I think at the end of the day, that there's going to be huge improvements and streamlining created as an outcome of this process.
Thanks so much, Bobby. I'm just going to move around the questions just because I've already gotten to a couple from the same people. I guess one of the questions is pertaining to provincial parks and specifically the Carden-Alver Provincial Park. How are we addressing provincial parks, or how are we protecting them, or sort of those really special natural areas? Certainly we want to make sure that any well-known and defined sensitive environmental features are in a protective zone category. But like I said in the presentation, we got to be able to map that accurately. So certain features like that feature that's being referenced, or provincially significant wetlands, like I mentioned in the presentation, if we can get really solid data, that can give us a good basis to consider updating the zoning and making sure that these important features are in a protective zone category. So I think that would be my response to that question. We can certainly look at it. Okay. perhaps just a comment I'll read out for the benefit. Oh, there is a question, sorry, at the end there, pardon me. So this person remains, I guess, a bit concerned about the irregular shape of some cottage properties and, you know, how property or the ability to develop on a lot will be curtailed by the proposed additional waterfront setback. I guess what assurances will there be to seasonal property owners that changes won't be used to prevent basic improvements? Bobby, perhaps, yeah.
And it's an important question, and again, you know, I think we've got quite a task in front of us, which is, you know, A, to try to bring these bylaws together and consolidate them, but B, not to change people's, you know, permissions too much. I think what our approach is going to be is to be one of balance to some extent. You know, we need to advance the environmental policies of the official plan, but we don't want to inadvertently, you know, render someone's property unbuildable when it's perfectly reasonable to be built upon. And we certainly don't want to hinder someone's ability to do reasonable things on their property, like certainly repairing, restoring your building. That's not going to be affected by the zoning bylaw. Even if you no longer meet the setbacks of the new zoning bylaw and so on, you'll always be able to repair and rebuild your home. But where the zoning bylaw has some weight is with respect to additions. So if you do not meet the new requirements of the zoning, like for example, if we change the setbacks from the water's edge, which the official plan is really directing us to do, if we increase that setback and a building doesn't comply with it anymore, then we have discretion in the zoning bylaw to restrict expansions or not. But that's kind of where it ends. The zoning bylaw won't affect someone's ability to repair their property or do reasonable things like accessory structures. We're going to be doing quite a bit of work to make sure that the new zones that we write and develop are going to work. They're going to be feasible and they're going to make sense based on what we're seeing on the ground. And I think too, this is why I like to emphasize that the process of developing a zoning bylaw is very iterative. Right, it's not this first draft isn't going to be this final perfect thing, but rather the first draft is really intended for consultation, and we expect to make multiple rounds of revisions to that document before it comes out to council for adoption. So we really encourage people, you know, to check our work. You know, we'll check it ourselves too, but if you want to check the proposed zoning on your property, you know, make sure it makes sense and that it's not going to unreasonably hinder you. We'd very much welcome that review and input. It would be very helpful to us.
Thanks so much, Bobby. Just scrolling up here. This might be a question. I'll pass it to Bobby first, and city staff might weigh in. Is this process or the end result appealable to the LPAT or the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, formerly known as the OMB?
Yes, certainly the comprehensive zoning bylaw can be appealed to the LPAT, and there are different rules and procedures in place under the Planning Act that guide who's eligible for an appeal and so on.
Okay.
And also, I should note too, when the notices go out for statutory consultation, like the consultation that we'll do later this year, along with when the bylaw is adopted, those notices will contain information about appeals and how to do so if that's someone's desire. My strong preference is if somebody wants to appeal, to please reach out to us first so that we can have an opportunity to go over the concerns. You know, we want to be collaborative with people, and if there are issues, we want to make sure that we have those conversations and we can iron those out before we bring this bylaw to council.
Thanks, Bobby. I'm going to go to the waterfront, and then I'm going to go to agricultural severances. So I guess a couple questions, and I'm going to try and sort of stitch them together just for continuity. So for example, for existing waterfront properties that currently comply with the water setback that would not comply with the proposed 30-meter setback, there would be criteria that would have to be met in order to add a rebuild, as Bobby suggested. This would require every building permit application to undergo a review. This suggests a major increase in the bureaucracy of building permit approvals. Can you comment on this? And there's just another comment on sort of like building on that is, you know, how is it possible that a building can expand, in a way that, like a non-conforming building expand in a way that's not to be further non-conforming? How is that possible? So perhaps you can tackle that in one, Bobby.
So there's a lot there. I'm not sure I followed all of that, but
Okay.
So I'm just reading one of the questions here. So
So perhaps maybe I'll break it apart. The first being, how can a non-conforming building be, expanded in a way that it's not further non-conforming? So you suggested that it would be permitted to expand, but not further into the waterfront or something like that.
Yeah, so for example, if suppose we updated the bylaw and we now require a minimum 30-meter water's edge setback, and suppose someone has an existing house that's 15 meters from the water's edge, under the new bylaw, the new dwelling doesn't comply. That makes it a legal non-complying building. It was legally constructed, but it doesn't meet the setback anymore. So what we can do in the new zoning bylaw is have provisions that say, you know what, you don't comply with the 30-meter setback, you do comply with the 15-meter setback. So we're going to let you kind of expand, left and right, just as long as you don't further encroach into the waterfront setback. So as long as you keep up with that 15 meters, you can expand a little bit more either way. But we can also say, is that enough? We can add almost like, I don't want to say it this way, but almost like incentivized provisions where we say, if you want to expand within that 30-meter setback, which isn't really contemplated by the policy, you can do it, but you have to do other things. Like you have to naturalize the shoreline, or you have to do other things. So, there are things we can do that give some flexibility, but the city's also advancing the objectives of the official plan, if you understand my meaning. So there can be sort of these two things that we can do at the same time. And then obviously, if a building doesn't comply with the new setbacks of the bylaw, so again, if it's a 15-meter setback, but 30 meters is required, the building wouldn't be constrained in terms of its ability to expand in any other direction. So on the street edge, like the front yard facing the road, if they meet that setback, that's no problem. That can expand in any way. It's really just, if they don't meet one of these new setbacks, should we allow them to expand or not? And I think we're kind of open to hearing input on that one.
Great, thanks, Bobby. And I'll come back to the next question after. City staff might want to weigh in on this one. Will severances be allowed on farms in the new plan? They have been on hold for the past years. And I guess a follow-up to that being regarding rural residential severances, will the present severance for rural residential remain as 1 acre per 62.5 acres?
Okay, thanks, Matt. That's a good question. I'd say that's a good portion of our questions that we get from people. So one of the things that governs that we have to follow is provincial policy, and provincial policy has really limited the number of severances and where severances are available in rural areas. So if you're in a prime agricultural area, so that's class 1 to 3 farmland, the province has said no to any more severances off of farms. They don't want to have more homes in those areas because it impacts the ability of farmers to farm. There is some opportunity in what are called rural areas in our official plan. Farmers are allowed to have one retirement lot for a retiring farmer, but unfortunately the days of having a few severances off the farm aren't permitted anymore, and that has a lot to do with provincial policy, which is trying to protect the agricultural areas for farming. So I think that's been the case in our official plan. Certainly in the new official plan, that's been the direction. that we followed, and that's been in place for since 2012 now. So I don't expect that is anything that's going to change, and certainly our zoning bylaw will have to sort of follow that direction as well.
Thanks, Richard. Just recognizing the time. So what I'm going to do is we have still a few questions in the queue that I think we want to get to. And so we'll certainly work through those. And, recognizing that we did say we'd wrap up around past, we'll stay on and wrap up through those questions. But if more questions come in, we'll certainly won't be ignoring those. We'll take those away and we'll provide some responses on the Jump in Kawartha Lakes page as a follow-up. So hopefully that sounds fair to folks. Again, we appreciate everyone's input and time this evening, and don't want to keep anyone later than we promised. So I'll jump into the next question, and Bobby might want to take this. Will MDS, or minimum distance separation regulations for agricultural uses, be incorporated into the zoning bylaw?
That's a great question, and absolutely. So for a bit of context, minimum distance separation regulations refer to provincial formulae and requirements for separating livestock and livestock type facilities from more sensitive uses to help mitigate odor impacts. So, I think we'll be looking to different best practices to inform our approach here, but in a lot of other municipalities and a lot of other bylaws, what you usually find is at least some kind of a reference to MDS. You don't try to replicate MDS in the zoning bylaw because I think it's really more like computer software to be able to make those calculations. But you may make reference to MDS, and you may simply have a general provision that applies to certain uses, which states that MDS shall be complied with. And then in order to get your building permit, the city would have to confirm that, that you've done that.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The MDS requirements are built out specifically in a few of our zoning bylaws right now. So they are to be complied with. At times, there are site-specific zones that were informed by an MDS requirement at one time. So those setbacks become a site-specific zone requirement, and then would have to be amended through a zoning bylaw amendment at this time. And just to touch on, there were two questions that came in like one after another, and both did relate to MDS. So I know Gail had one. Do we anticipate a change to setbacks required for the presence of animals and manure in housing developments? Like Bobby said, these will be held to the MDS requirements. So they won't, if MDS changes at some point in the future from the province, then those setbacks would change potentially. But at this time, we are enforcing MDS and will continue to do so.
Great, thanks so much, John and Bobby. Bobby, this is a great question. I know it came up at our technical advisory committee and at some of the open houses. What is the role of the MTO in relation to modified regulations? And I guess just to jump to it, what document, if an MTO regulation was in place, what document would trump? So for example, if the Ministry of Transportation had some regulation in the Hamlet zone, what happens if there's a conflict there?
That's a great question, and yeah, we certainly have MTO on our technical advisory committee that's helping us to inform the approach that we want to take. Yeah, I mean, suffice it to say, the Ministry of Transportation, obviously they operate a number of different roads and highways throughout the city of Kawartha Lakes, and because it's their jurisdiction, that means that they get to impose certain setbacks. I don't know that the MTO regulations would affect land use. I think it's much more about the setbacks, and it's really up to the local municipalities to assess land use. But we're looking at a couple of things, and one of the key topics things we've been discussing as a team is, to what extent should the zoning bylaw try to integrate the requirements of other agencies? Because setbacks and all this other stuff addressed by zoning, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's other agency requirements that have to be complied with. The problem with including, like, for example, MTO's setbacks is they might change from time to time. It's not really what the city wants per se, it's what MTO wants. And so what I could actually see is there's a couple of things we could do. We could either try to integrate those requirements, and that may be on a selective basis where it's very desirable to do so. Like, If there's a provincial highway and there's just simply lots of applications coming forward and it just simply makes sense to put the setback in the zoning, then we can do that. Or we can also consider putting in references to other agency requirements in sort of a guide to the zoning bylaw. So we can have sort of like a user document to the zoning bylaw, and we can say, hey, in addition to meeting this bylaw, you should also check with MTO, for example. So certainly it's a great question, because it is a key thing that we're thinking about, is to what extent do we need to be trying to encompass other agency requirements?
And MTO is on the technical advisory committee, as we previously discussed. So they are reviewing these documents with us. They haven't been involved in this process thus far. During a rezoning application or some sort of land use application, MTO is certainly circulated those applications, so they do see those. And then based on what's proposed, they have their certain requirements for setbacks or allowances or whatnot. So certainly we do work with them quite closely on a different variety of projects.
Great. And I do see our numbers dropping off here, and some thanks and compliments in the chat box. We really do appreciate everyone joining. As I said, we'll stay on and answer the last remaining questions here in the chat box for sure. But if you are looking for some more information, want to submit some comments, or look at this presentation in the coming days, visit the Jump In Kawartha Lakes page. It's jumpinkawarthalakes.com, and you're able to view all the information there. Question perhaps for city staff. Will the city hold off on approving permits for new building, example on a vacant waterfront lot, until the new zoning bylaws are in place?
If there are currently zoning bylaws in place for those areas, so if the building permit or building application can meet those requirements, we would certainly not hold off on that, as there are currently bylaws in place that we would use to regulate new development with. So no pause on that type of building permit issuance.
If I can chime in on that one too, Matt.
Yeah,
I think it's an important question and point, is that, this process doesn't hold up other stuff. The city's continuing to process applications. If you want to make an application, you can certainly still do that. And the one thing I should say too is that we need to be thinking about transition. So when the new zoning bylaw comes into effect, the city is going to be amidst processing a whole bunch of applications. So we're going to have to be thinking about, how does the new zoning bylaw affect stuff that the city's just received an application for, or will receive an application for, if the zoning bylaw is under appeal. There's a lot of these like little technical questions around transition that we'll have to wrap our heads around.
That's helpful context as well. This is actually a really interesting question, and something that I know we were working on a couple of weeks ago. A question regarding agricultural zoning. Within agricultural zoning, are you allowed to build a second house on a 100-acre farm? And that's that second farm, or that second residential dwelling. I don't know if city staff want to comment at first, or if Bobby has something.
Yeah, sure. So some of the agricultural zones, do currently permit a second dwelling unit in some of the bylaws. At the same time, moving forward, we do have what is called a additional residential dwelling unit program that could potentially permit a additional residential dwelling unit, additional house to be built on those lands.
That's helpful. And touching on Bobby's point earlier, the city's already undergone some zoning and policy changes for some of that will weave into the rural zoning bylaw. Okay, I think we're slowly weaving to the end. Maybe I don't think I got to this question. And perhaps for Bobby first, if I rebuild a new cottage on an existing footprint, slightly plan to expand and meet the 30-meter setback, how will I be impacted by the new zoning bylaw?
I think that'll just depend on what the new zone for your property says. But it kind of sounds to me, based on that scenario, if you'd be meeting the 30-meter setback, you shouldn't be restricted too much more. I think for the most part, other than the waterfront setbacks, we'll probably just carry forward the existing setbacks right now. But for the other yards, so the side yard setbacks, the front yard setback, like from the street, that shouldn't change too much. So if you're meeting the 30 meters and you meet the other setbacks, I think you should be good. But if you are thinking about, building a new cottage or rebuilding a cottage or a home, I definitely think checking out that draft bylaw when it comes out will be beneficial, and we'd be more than happy to convene a discussion with you about your specific circumstance.
Great, thanks, Bobby. I think we might only have one or two left here. I guess there was just a question following up on the workshops that we had. Was there any consensus or preference or sort of opposing views, or what was some of the outcomes perhaps of those workshops?
I can chime in with some thoughts there. I thought the workshops that we had were excellent discussions, and they were small groups because we wanted to have really in-depth discussions with people and dive into the details. I would say, one of the reasons for who was involved in those workshops was because we wanted different perspectives. So I would say those conversations by design had different conflicting opinions. But I do think that we had some good outcomes and good interesting context conveyed to us in those discussions. And I think we're open to, like I said in the presentation, if there are members of the public that want to dive into some of these topics and have a conversation with us, we have flexibility. We can look to even convene another series of workshops. We'll have to discuss that with city staff, but I think we're flexible. So I appreciate that question.
Okay, I think we're winding to the end here, and I might call this our last question. But again, we'll go through and make sure we've addressed any and provide some answers on the jump in page after. I guess why can agricultural land or a farm be developed as solar farms, which means a loss of agricultural land when you cannot sever a 1 acre lot? And city staff or Bobby might want to weigh in on that.
Go ahead, Richard.
I can answer that one. So a lot of the solar farms were developed under provincial legislation. Now, a lot of what they were trying to do was they were trying to keep them away from our prime agricultural lands. So they weren't allowed to be on the class 1 to 3 lands, but they were allowed to be on sort of the lower 4 to 7 class lands. I think to answer the question, I think the province felt that renewable energy was a very important piece for them from an overall production perspective, and they felt that this could be allowed to happen on farmland. Now, I think from their perspective, they felt that these were temporary uses in the sense that once the lease expires for these solar farms, everything would be cleared out and they would then be reverted back to farmland. So I think that was part of the thinking for the province. Obviously, when the current government dismantled the legislation, and so there's no more new solar farms being constructed. They're viewed as temporary. I guess the severance of lots off of a farm would be considered as a permanent. So I think that's probably the best observation that I could offer on that question.
Okay, and this will be formally our last question, then we'll let everyone go for the evening. And these are really interesting scenarios, and I think really great that people are flagging them. So on a lot with 2 shore lot lines, so front and back, how would one get permission to expand when the lot is only about 8 meters deep? We might not have a detailed answer, but I think we'll certainly be taking this one away. I drew a little sketch of it to take that away for future reference.
Yeah, I think though, there's always going to be these one-off unusual kind of scenarios in zoning, right? And unusual lot configurations. And the reality is the new zoning bylaw, it just realistically, it can't contemplate every single scenario. Like, we're going to do our best to make sure that we're covering things off. But under the Planning Act, there's a process called the minor variance process, which is an opportunity for someone to make a tweak to the zoning bylaw, and for that to be assessed against the official plan amongst other criteria. A minor variance process is a relatively affordable planning process. It should only take about a month or two to complete. So that's kind of the mechanism for dealing with a very site-specific scenario. But I should say too, though, that we can also include general provisions in the bylaw. So for example, a lot of bylaws, what they'll say is, hey, look, if you've got residential zoning, if you're on a lot of record, i.e. your lot's already been legally created, the new requirements of the zoning bylaw are not going to prevent you from having a dwelling on your lot, as long as that was permitted when the bylaw came into effect. So we can kind of grandfather situations where a dwelling might not otherwise be totally feasible. We can make sure that that's kind of addressed broadly across the city. So it's a great question.
And to jump in on that, there are general regulations for what we would call an island lot. So with having shorelines on either side, a front and back on the waterfront, would be considered an island lot. And the general regulations, like in particular, escape me at this moment, but they are accounted for in some of our current zoning bylaws.
Yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. I think this specific thing will be addressed specifically in the bylaw. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of the discussion. Really appreciate everyone's time this evening and for engaging in the chat box. I think we got through a lot of great topics, questions, and sort of, at least gave me some stuff to think about, and hopefully everyone else to think about as we go forward with this project. And so, as Bobby said, we'll be looking to come back out into the community once that first draft zoning bylaw is posted, and we'll be having some similar sessions and having some other opportunities to get involved. As I said, in the meantime, feel free to visit the Jump In Kawartha Lakes webpage. Contact information is available there for city staff, some resources, the discussion paper, the issues report that we discussed, as well as sort of all sorts of other resources, including some of the workshop findings. So you're certainly welcome to explore those.
We do strongly encourage you to register for the Jump In platform. There are opportunities to provide comments, like kind of a message board type style, like a forum where you can write comments and have them responded to. There's a mapping feature that allows you to drop a pin on a specific location within the city that you may have a zoning concern with, or something site specific that has yet to be identified. And each time that page is updated with new information, you will get an email notification. So it is a very useful tool for this project in particular. As we move forward with the rural zoning bylaw project, we are going to look to use that as our main hub of communication and pushing information out to you folks.
Yeah, that's great context. Thanks, John, for that. And yeah, that'll certainly be the central hub of information to go back to. So on that note, thank you again for joining us this evening. This formally concludes the Citywide Public Open House. Thank you all so much, and hopefully you can squeeze in some daylight or a little walk this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Good night.